Hello, hey everybody, good morning. Welcome. Can I invite you to get comfortable, grab a seat, and we have a very fine day today and a great talk. So let me begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where we meet today, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people here in Canberra. I pay my respects to elders past and present and celebrate that this land is full of knowledge systems. My name is Josh Andres. I'm a senior lecturer here at the School of Cybernetics, and I am also the chair for the ACM SITCAI Human-Computer Interaction chapter. So this event is co-hosted by the School of Cybernetics and by the Canberra chapter, and you can see the QR codes there. You can subscribe to the school's newsletter to learn about the different educational offerings and programs and events, and also to the Canberra ACM SITCAI chapter. So let me introduce today's speakers. So first we have Professor Martin Tomitsch, who is the head of the Transdisciplinary School at UTS. And we also have Steve Baty, who is the director and chair of MELD Studios in Sydney. So welcome to you both, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody, and thanks for having us here. I think, Martin, you've got...
Yeah. I've got the clicker.
You've got, yes, you've got control.
Good morning, everyone. And yeah, thank you, Josh, for the introduction, and thank you for having us. It's really a great honor and pleasure to be here. So great to be back at NU. I've been here many times, mostly for the OSCAI conference, for those of you who know OSCAI. And also, in particular, great to connect with the Cybernetics School, given my current role at UTS at the Transdisciplinary School, because there are a lot of alignments and synergies, of course, between those two schools. Also wanted to say today's, I mean, it's not a typical talk, maybe, Steve. I think it's more like a conversation. We wanted to have a bit of a discussion here, show some examples from the book, and then have a conversation with people in the room. Because just talking to some people beforehand, it's quite amazing the knowledge we have in the room and people working on super interesting and impactful projects. So we're also really keen to hear from everyone here. Anything else before we get started, Steve, from your side? Let's start. Okay. All right. So the talk today, again, thank you to ANU and the Cybernetics School, and also to Canberra ACM SITCAI chapter for the invitation. The talk today is based on our book that we published with Steve early this year called Designing Tomorrow. And can I say this? We will have some copies later. Yeah, we'll have some copies to give away later, but we'll talk about that at the end.
We're not taking those home.
We're not taking those back to Sydney. This is not our slide. Thank you. Thank you. So I just also wanted to acknowledge before we look at some of the content of the book that there is, even though Steve and I are standing here in front of you and our names are on the front of the book, on the book cover, there was a large team that was involved in working on this book. It took us about 2 years to from when we started with the idea to actually having the book published. And I just think it's really important to acknowledge the teamwork that goes into doing something like this. And we managed to get a group further when we had the official book launch in Sydney at MELD Studios, which is Steve's strategic design agency. And I just wanted to acknowledge all of the people. So we have Ellen, Jen, and Diana Ayub from Shapeshifters. They're an illustration agency, a little studio doing amazing graphic design work. And they worked with us on the illustrations for the book, not just as graphic designers, but we really went through a co-design process where we regularly met and talked about the topics we wanted to cover, and they were sketching it out at the same time, and then we were discussing the sketches and iterating. So it's a really amazing process that really helped shape the narrative of the book as well as, of course, being a really beautiful object in its final form. We had 2 editors that we were working with. So Jacqueline Hall was one of our editors. She has actually a background in journalism and also in economics. And so I was able to also bring that background in, as well as her role as an editor to the book. One of her main tasks was to cut back our amount of text that we were writing. So it was too many ideas you have in your head that you want to put down, and she was like, bring it back, make it shorter, more concise, write facts, examples, also especially for me as an academic, always going too much into theory, and she was like, write examples. And then we also had a second editor, Verity Borthwick, who has actually a PhD in geosciences. And we talk a lot about the environment in the book. And so again, she was able to bring that background to the book as well as being an amazing editor. And she just told me actually 2 days ago that she got a contract with a publisher to write her first fiction novel, which is pretty exciting. So the book is sort of, the idea of the book is that it draws on and expands this idea of human-centered design, or the notion of human-centered design. And I'm assuming most people here in this room would be familiar with this diagram, which has been used. I've been using that teaching students for over a decade to sort of articulate the different areas we have to consider when we think about innovation. And that was fine for a while. And my business bought into this idea and started funding, investing in design capability within businesses and organizations. Was great for universities and for us academics teaching design, because there was a boom in design degrees and students, graduates, and jobs. So that was all great. But we sort of have arrived at a point where we are realizing that human-centered design is not always great, because it prioritizes the well-being and the needs of humans above everything else. And so in the book, we're arguing for a shift from human-centered design to what is referred to, what we call life-centered design. And so as you can see here, the idea is that in life-centered design, we're decentering actually the needs of the human, and the human, which might be the user or the customer, just becoming like one part of the system of entities that we need to consider. And that includes also the environment, ecosystems, nature, and so on. And so we sort of illustrated in the book with a simple, very simplified, and we acknowledge that it's very simplified extension of this diagram by adding the responsibility bubble, the responsibility perspective. And for the designers in the room, we also argue that designers actually ideally positioned to be the custodians of the responsibility bubble, because we may not be experts in environmental sciences or conservation sciences, but we know how to bring different voices together. We know how to represent underrepresented entities, or entities that are not considered at all in the design process, how to gather data about those perspectives, including the perspectives of ecosystems, and then bringing them into a design process. And so we expand on that a little bit in the book. And we also present towards at the end of the book, actually, we present this idea of developing a life-centered design mindset and describe these principles, which were actually based on some work we've done with some of my colleagues from the Life-Centered Design Collective. That's a group of people distributed around the world. A lot of them are, like Steve, design practitioners working on this in practice and in industry. And so these principles are a way to bring life-centered design to any project. And the book itself is not just written for designers, but also for any decision makers. So the idea that we can use this idea of strategic design tactics in any kind of project, whether we're a designer or any other form of decision maker. And I should have said this earlier, this is not necessarily a very academic book, in that it's really trying to bridge the gap between academia and practice, and translating some of the research that has happened in academia with practice, and by providing very applicable and actionable framework of tactics, which includes strategies and tools that people can apply. Now, this is important because obviously of the state of the world in which we find ourselves today. And a recent study found that the amount of human-made stuff, so all the things we can see around us, the buildings, the streets, the roads, the cars, the chairs, the coffee cups that we used out there earlier, all of that stuff actually outweighs now all of natural life on the planet, which is kind of insane to think about it that way. That's also connected to this idea of the, this is a small issue with the slide, but it says empty world on the left and full world on the right. So connected to this model developed by the environmental economist Herman Daly, who passed away sadly a couple of years ago, who came up with this notion many years ago, sort of talking about the limits of growth. And actually Kate Raworth, who some people might be familiar with, and I work around circular economy and the donut model, donut economics, actually references this diagram from Herman Daly as a source of inspiration for the donut economic model. And so essentially what Herman Daly was saying is that a lot of the economic systems that we're still using today they were developed during the 60s at a time when we, and assuming that we have an infinite amount of resources available to us, and also that the planet has an infinite capacity to regenerate itself and to deal with waste, essentially. And that's what he calls the empty world view of the that economic thinking is based on. And I'm not an economist, and I haven't studied economics, but apparently what both Herman Daly and Kate Raworth say is that this is the kind of thinking that is still being taught at economics schools. And what we argue in the book is that even as designers and decision makers, we have to develop a basic understanding of economics, because at the end of the day, whatever we design, the decisions we make, it all contributes to the economy and the world. And so Herman Daly is saying that over time, and because the economy has been growing due to population growth, urbanization, massive urbanization, industrialization, the industrial revolutions, we are using more and more products and manufacturing more and more things. So we have actually exceeded the natural boundaries of the planet. And so that's why we're now living in a full world where this black circle, which represents the economy, is exceeding the boundary of the, sorry, the black square is exceeding the boundary of the yellow circle, which represents Earth and its resources, natural resources. And that's in essence also what Kate Raworth is visualizing through the donut economic model, but it's a bit more complex, and it also provides a way to measure performance against the different parameters, which is why it's a really useful model. And that's also extended to the use of digital services and infrastructures. So often, in particular, because I've been teaching for a large part of my own career, the interaction design and user experience design students, and talking to user experience designers. And often we think like, we're just designing digital interactions, so there's nothing physical that we design. But we forget that actually the digital, those digital experiences are all using physical infrastructure that is also manufactured, has to be produced, has to be maintained. In the case of data centers, has to be cooled down using resources, and at the end has to be disposed of. So all of that is actually also using and adding to the waste of natural resources and the exploitation of natural resources, and to land waste and landfill. And that's, of course, even getting more significant now as a problem with the rise of generative AI and other new technologies. So in the book, we describe 3 different pillars. So the book is structured according to 3 different pillars and 9 tactics. So each of the pillars covers 3 tactics, and you can see them on this diagram, which is a bit of a compass that we use in the book to guide the reader through the different sections of the book. And the 3 pillars you can see here are the networks, interventions, and the partnerships. We're not going to go through all of them today, but just wanted to show you also the overview of the 3 pillars broken down then by tactics, tools, and strategies. So each of the tactics has a number of tools and strategies that we describe in the book with examples, again, with the idea that to make this kind of thinking more practically applicable in the real world. And maybe, Steve, do you want to talk at this point about the idea of the 1% change? Because that might be nice.
One of the things that we introduce in the book, and one of the sort of focal points at the end of each chapter, is this idea that a lot of the A lot of the issues that we see today are the result of exponential growth or compounding change over time. We didn't have a situation where it was okay and then suddenly it was bad. We had systems that built up these sort of negative impacts over time to get us to where we are today. The same thing is possible with positive interventions. So we can redesign those systems or design interventions into those systems that similarly compound over time. And this idea of, well, what's a 1% change that will compound over time? So literally in 50 or 60 or 70 years, we will have, sort of gone through this sort of magnitude change. But year by year by year, we don't have to try and make a magnitude change. We can just redesign the systems so that they have this sort of compounding effect or exponential effect over time. That's sort of one of the sort of consistent themes through the book that we'll talk about. And I've got an example of one that I'll read. But it's this idea that we don't have to try and make massive interventions. But the better intervention for us, and whether we're talking about tax incentives or R&D credits or pollution taxes or carbon border adjustment mechanisms or whatever it might be, they don't have to be big, but they have to be exponential. And identifying those points of intervention in the system is one of the critical things that we really need to start doing much better.
So since that previous slide was quite small, we're zooming here on the first pillar, which are the networks. And so again, the 3 chapters dedicated to that pillar for the 3 different tactics around understanding the larger system, identifying unintended consequences, and capturing diverse perspectives. And we're going to touch a little bit more on those first 2 tactics now with the next section of our session today. So I'll hand over to Steve.
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit.
Talk about the system.
Do you want to give me the control?
Yeah, great.
Familiarize myself with the complex interaction design of, I think I've got it. Okay, so this is an example of a system map. You may or may not have seen them. I'm sure in a place like this, they float around and you will have seen them over time. But the idea is simply to understand what is the dynamic and the shape and the relationships of the different actors within a system? What are the things that are happening? And in particular, one of the things that we really want people to focus on is that dynamic. So what is the relationship, positively or negatively, between the different elements of the system? So if I want something to increase or decrease, what are the other things that I might influence rather than trying to increase that thing directly? And one of the things I think we see a lot in Australian policy, in Australian business, is this idea that if I want to impact this thing, which happens to be investment in cycle-friendly infrastructure, that what I need to do is put in place investment in cycle-friendly infrastructure, that's the thing that I have to do. And the reality is that actually there's a whole bunch of things that positively impact that thing, and maybe one of those other things will be easier for me to intervene in. Maybe for much less money, I can shift the helmet law so that more people ride, more people start demanding better infrastructure, and the funding comes more easily. And we get the infrastructure without having to advocate for infrastructure. It's that kind of mindset that says, let's understand these systems better and be in a position to really target our influence and subsequently our impact. That's the logic of it. And we talk about it quite a bit in the book. And it's one of the things that I think from a design point of view in particular, we really want to advocate for the design community to start thinking more in these sorts of terms and in these, the design of a point solution only. And I know that systems thinking is a core part of what you do and how you think. And which is awesome. And what we want to see is more of that type of thinking right across not only universities and design schools and engineering schools, but public policy and corporate Australia as well. This is a much more complicated map, and this is more where things really lie when you start to map any kind of system. Martin made the point that economics seems to be a little behind the times in terms of its models and the way in which it does things. Anyone here studied mathematics to any particular degree? 1. Wow. Okay. Mathematics.
I think 3, 4 people.
Yeah, there you go. Okay. I did. And one of the things that you find when you deal with mathematics, particularly at an undergraduate level, whenever you come across any sort of complex system, the first thing that the example will say is, assume a linear relationship, or assume a linear equation, or assume a set of linear equations, right? And it's this really standard way of simplifying the problem such that an undergraduate can solve it. And as soon as you actually look at the reality of these things, which is nonlinear complex systems and systems of nonlinear equations or nonlinear systems of equations, the math gets too hard. And I think that's what's happened with economics by and large. The maths is too hard, and so they avoid it by and large. But the reality is that our systems look much more like this, and they're complicated. The relationships are hard to model. Yes?
11 factors on ANU about the future of ANU a while ago.
Okay.
And the reality of taking things from the first image that you had.
Yes.
Acknowledging that the system looks more like this, and then acknowledging the fact that each person that you ask, you end up with a slightly different shape, and then that changes day to day.
Yes.
How are you bridging that gap? Smart perspective and the other task there would end up with positive and negative versions of those factors. So things shift, the arrows change.
So,
do we need to repeat the question, Josh?
Well, yeah. So I might repeat the question. If I understand the question correctly, the reality is the practical upshot of talking to enough people to get insight into this sort of system to take you from this version of it to this version of it. The relationships aren't as fixed or as easy to identify as 2 diagrams might represent, and I'm not pretending that it's easy. We avoid it because it's hard, but we've created a mess of problems because we're avoiding that hard work. And we're doing it in places where it really has an impact, and we really need to do something else about it. So it's not easy, and it is complicated, and there is a lot of work involved.
Can I add to that, Steve?
Yeah.
And also, again, assuming I understand your question correctly, which I may not, but if it was about how do we, I guess we have these different perspectives, and if each of us in this room draw a systems map, it will look differently. So in the book, actually, we talk about a slightly different method, a variation of this method that has been documented in the literature called participatory systems mapping. Where you actually involve everyone in this room, for example, and the expertise in designing a systems map collectively. And that way, hopefully, you will still have gaps, and it's also important to acknowledge those gaps and be aware of blind spots. But at least then that it's a way to have a more fuller picture of a potential system, and also a way to draw on the expertise of people that you might bring together. And again, as designers, we know how to do this because we know how to bring people together through co-design workshops or participatory workshops. And so this is a sort of combining that element of design with systems thinking.
Perspectives that are distributed before you get to the conversation and keep them separate, and you can get dynamics that way.
Yes.
Many different ways.
Yes. I encourage much more of it is the punchline, whilst recognizing that it's not easy. One of the things that a map like this does do for you is that it makes clear where your boundaries are, and the things that you've determined are inside your system and the things that you've decided are outside your system. Now, as many of you may have sort of run into in the past, that's an arbitrary choice normally. Certainly in the real world, boundaries are arbitrary choices. We're not normally dealing with things that have a clear inside and outside, except by definition. When a corporation draws a boundary and said, I don't have to worry about anything outside this circle or outside this shape, what they create is somebody else's problem. And we see that a lot with pollution. We see that a lot with waste. We see that a lot with recycling. Those sorts of issues have been designated by the corporation as somebody else's problem. And somebody is normally the environment or taxpayers. And we allow it. And again, we think this is something that needs to shift. I recently joined the board of the Product Stewardship Centre of Excellence, which is a group run out of the Institute of Sustainable Futures at UTS. And this idea of producer responsibility and actually drawing a broader boundary around your activities is inherent to this idea of what product stewardship is about. If you produce something, then you remain responsible for it right throughout its life cycle is the basic tenet of product stewardship. Anyway, here's another one. Again, it's a simplified diagram, but the idea is simply that somewhere along the way, and we're thinking here in terms of broad societal systems, the economy, health, the environment, social systems, that kind of thing, what are those interventions that we might take? Anyway.
And can I ask if anyone here in this room is teaching students systems thinking? A few people, excellent. So I started doing that a few years ago, and obviously at the transdisciplinary school at UTS, that's one of the things that I guess distinguishes us. Our students have to learn in the first year how to do systems mapping. But what I find sort of people get it in theory, and then when they start trying to do it, it's really hard. It's quite hard, and in particular when you get to explaining the feedback loops, so the reinforcing loops and the balancing loops, then it gets really complex. And so the first ever time I tried to run this workshop, and it was actually with postdocs and PhDs even at my previous university, it completely failed. Like people were just like, I don't know what's going on here. And I realized, okay, I went way too fast. I need to go much slower when it comes to systems mapping and really taking people through the process. So it's quite a complex tool to teach and to learn. But as with everything, it's about practice. So, and again, I'm really excited that now I'm in a school where we are teaching this, as I said, as part of our first year curriculum. And the students that are graduating from that program have an understanding not just how this works as a tool mechanically, but also how to have an understanding of the role of systems thinking in the world.
We allow organizations and we allow individuals to make choices that have far-reaching implications without them having to take responsibility for those implications far too often. I say that without giving examples, and we will go into some examples soon, but the way in which industry is constructed and the way in which public policy is constructed quite often allows individuals and companies to abdicate their responsibilities for things that were entirely foreseeable. Had they been responsible for it in the first place, they would never have done. So there are elements there where this type of mindset, and it is difficult, the idea that we acknowledge the ongoing implications that we might have with our decisions, that there will be secondary and tertiary impacts of whatever thing that we put in place in the first place, like what are those flow-on effects and ripple effects, depending on how you want to characterize them. Martin and I were having a conversation on the way in around investment decisions and how an investment decision might be made on the basis of a primary impact without ever sort of giving thought to the secondary or tertiary impacts that might come from those things. And again, we see it all the time.
Funding for universities.
Yes. Let me read just a small section that sort of speaks to this idea of 1% change and exponential growth over time. So this is from page 181 in the book. It's chapter 9, which is talking about implementing change. So Kari Ng's observation that organisations struggle to find the resources to implement positive change is one of the major obstacles to planetary action. This is where organisations fall over time and time again by failing to understand that positive change can be exponential too, starting small and compounding over time. Organisations look for ways to make a large, immediate change and consistently fail to begin the process of small change. My company is involved in supporting the Go Foundation, an organisation that supports Indigenous children in their education so that they can see themselves as the kind of person who finishes school, someone who takes on further education and embarks on a career while also maintaining their connection to culture and country. At present, too many children feel they need to choose between those two pathways. As an aside, the Go Foundation is currently experiencing its first university graduates from its program. And all of those graduates are the first people in their families, their extended families, not only to attend university, not only to graduate, but to attend at all. In some cases, they're the first ones to graduate high school. So our company sponsors 10 students. In itself, that's a small number, but those children become role models to inspire others to make different choices for themselves. It cascades over time. Each child going through this transformation influences more and more around them and shows a way of being that is consistent with their culture while pursuing the opportunities of a trade, university, or the arts. To further compound the impact of the work, the Go Foundation tries to help the oldest sibling first and prioritise families where no one has been to university or in some cases graduated from high school. If the founders of the Go Foundation, when they started the organisation 6 years ago, it's now 8, had said helping 10 kids isn't worth it, we should wait until we can help 100 or 1,000, they would have missed out on years of impactful support or never created any change at all. The key to successful change in the face of obstacles is to look for these kind of impactful small changes, the things we can do right now that have a compounding effect over time. This requires us to be selective and defer change that might be beyond our capabilities or capacity right now. I'll pause there.
And that's a great example of the use of examples in the book. So when in this particular section where we talk about change starting small and then going into an example to illustrate, and the same thing we do also do with other strategies and also the tools that we describe in the book. So I was drawing on examples to bring it back to something that's very applied and practical. And so in a way, again, as I said earlier, in that sense, it's not a very academically written book or academic book because it's very practical. And it's for the researchers in the room, it's also very different to do a peer-reviewed research article. And so it's much more about, obviously, the narrative and bringing things to life, which I really enjoy about writing books. There was a question there.
Yeah.
Change over time requires consistent culture or consistent conditions inside an organisation to see that sustained. Change in leadership, change of authority around decision making might relitigate decisions that have been made. I'd love to hear your perspective around how do you start to create that culture, or what are the cultural requirements of an organisation to see that 1% continue on beyond the tenure of a leadership group or an existing strategy?
So one of the places I see it a lot is in the economy around our tax structure. This idea of a leadership change. We have an election, someone new gets elected, and we always seem to lower taxes. It never seems to be the case that the right solution is to raise taxes. It's only ever to hold them steady or to lower them further. We've seen 40 years of decline in corporate tax rates. We've seen 40 years of decline in personal tax rates. The last tranche of changes, which cost us, $20 billion a year, at a time when we're cutting back on social programs, you sort of look at that and go, well, how is the condition there that the logic of that change can just flow through? So in an organisation where you might have a change of CEO, it's a smaller place and the likelihood of sweeping change is a little more easy to implement. But you're right, what you need to be doing, and this is why I talk about putting in place programs that look small, but that can compound, that become almost baked into the way you're doing things so that they become much harder to change. Now, those are conditions for the sort of thing that will persist into the future, not necessarily an answer to your question, but what I would be looking for is how do we make something like that naturally part of what we're doing so that it is much harder to unwind rather than an additional thing that's easy to cut off. If that makes sense.
It's a really great question. I mean, as another question, just And just to follow up on that question, I think for us, that's also where the role of strategic design comes in, and it's everything that Steve was just saying is essentially strategic design. And for me, writing this book was also a good reflection about my role as an academic, as a design academic, and realizing that because Steve is a practitioner, so he can draw on all these amazing examples working with big clients, like the Sydney Metro that just opened, for example, big projects. And I often go, I guess, as an academic, like, well, we only write about things in theory, or we do like little experiments that are quite detached from the real world. But I realized that as a design academic, I have been working as a strategic designer across the university, creating new programs and initiatives. And it's the same question. How do we set something up as it again? And it happens too often that academics set up a center or something, and as soon as they leave, the center falls apart or the initiative discontinues. So it's the same question, like how can we set this up strategically using strategic design tactics to ensure that it continues to thrive and to exist even after we move on. So that's, for me, that's also become a really important question, because it's about the long-term impact, and part of strategic design is also having that long-term perspective, and there's a whole chapter dedicated to envisioning futures and thinking long-term. We go to the question here. Yes. Maybe I'll give you the mic so we don't repeat it.
Thanks. Duncan Stevenson. The idea of having a small change, an incremental change in building on it, how do you decide the point at which your idea of a change is too big and it breaks things? I mean, I have this very problem exactly at work at the moment. We want to do too much, but there's a chance that it will fail completely because no one will be able to work with it.
I don't have a direct answer for you. My advice usually is prototype, pilot, test these things to see where that point might be, and to draw back from that threshold a little bit. But I think the mechanics of the change is more important than the size of the change in the first instance. So putting in place a dynamic of change such that whatever we get this year, we're going to get again next year and the year after and the year after that is more important than whether you make a 5 or a 10 or a 20% change this year. And this is our point, right? So to your point, putting in place a small change that you are confident will change over time is more important in the design of the intervention than that first bit. So if you're worried that it might be too big, by all means, pull back on it, but make sure the year after that you'll get it again and again and again.
So many questions. Should we continue with questions or hold questions?
I think so.
End?
Otherwise, you're going to change topics, and this one's clearly resonating.
Okay, if we go to the back next. So I think,
so where are we going? There?
Yes. And then I think the one before.
Tom Worthington from the School of Computing. Do we end up in the murky area of cross-disciplinary teams in trying to get these things to work? When I have computer nerds who want to do something, I send them to the Canberra Innovation Network to learn how to be financial or not-for-profit entrepreneurs. But they have to learn a different language and a different skill set. So we've in that problem there where designers on their own can't actually get anything to work.
Well, as head of the transdisciplinary school, I would say, yes, absolutely. We need to go there. And it's hard. It's really hard. And there was a study published a few months ago in the Harvard Business Review that found that working across the silos of an organization, which it's not just in universities, also in organizations, a problem, is more likely to lead to burnout, which, again, as head of transdisciplinary school, I thought, wow, that's interesting. And I can see it every day. Like, it's really, really hard work because you don't fit in the box and you speak all different languages. So everything takes a bit longer. It takes longer to agree or to agree to disagree. But yes, 100%, I would say.
I would also say that the core of most disciplines is more readily defined than the boundaries of any particular discipline. So if you're in murky territory, it's probably because you've moved away from that sort of core definition, and that's great. Like, that's where exploration happens. That's where interesting gaps occur and those sorts of things. So yes, it is likely to be murky territory, but I think that's where a lot of the fun and interesting stuff occurs as well. There were more comments here and here.
Should we take one more question then?
Yep.
And then go a bit more content and come back to questions again? Because we will have time for questions at the end as well.
A quick one. I'm Jess. I'm from the School of Cybernetics. When you talk about these small changes, how do you know that your small change is good? And if it's not good, how do you change track or retract that change?
I think when we did our last event, I used a quote from a science fiction or fantasy book called Wizard's First Rule, which is a book by a guy by the name of Terry Goodkin that was written about 30 odd years ago. But in it, and he talks about wizards and magic, but it's this idea that boils down to no good deed goes unpunished. That there will almost certainly be a negative impact or a negative, whether you got it wrong and it's actually a bad impact rather than a good impact, but there's a reasonable potential that a secondary or tertiary ripple effect will actually be detrimental. It is in the nature of systems, and especially these sorts of complex dynamics that we're talking about, that some of those flow-on effects may be bad. It's why I encourage pilots and prototyping these things early and testing it with the people who might use it, testing it in circumstances that might model the real world, so that you can see whether or not you get gamification taking place, or people, because they almost certainly will if they can. I'm involved in, there's some work going on in New South Wales at the moment around a product stewardship scheme for batteries. And this is one of the questions that we've got. How do we design a product stewardship scheme for batteries such that it won't be gamed by industry, that will actually deliver the positive environmental benefits that we're looking for, rather than setting up the conditions whereby people, essentially game the system and just do it for profit. And there aren't good answers other than try it, don't overcommit to it, and be in a position where you could roll it back based on that pilot response as easily as you can.
Really great questions. We'll do a little bit more content and then more questions, maybe.
Let's talk about Mexico City.
Let's talk about Mexico City. Before that, I also wanted to say that, so each of the chapters of the book, we start with a little story. Essentially, you set the scene of the chapter, and then we also return throughout the chapter to those stories. And our amazing graphic designers, or illustrators, I should say, from Shapeshifters, Ellen and Diana, helped us to visualize those little stories. So those are the postcards you can see on your chairs. Those are the chapter illustrations. And each chapter has a subtitle that's based on that story. And on the back of your postcard, you can see actually this is 9 different versions of the postcard in the room for the 9 different tactics. And there's also on the back of the postcard the name of the tactic and a little bit of a description of each of the tactic. So if you get all 9 postcards, you have all 9 tactics. So the chapter I'm going to read from, I'm just going to read the first, the opening section. It's chapter 2, and it's called Hidden Impacts of Design Decisions. And the subtitle of this chapter is Highways and Cobras. Mexico City has a car problem. Home to 22 million people, the metropolitan area is sliced by highways, ring roads, and one-way streets that run from one side of the city across to the other. People rely heavily on cars, making it one of the most congested cities in the world. However, being stuck in traffic is not Mexico City's commuters' biggest problem. A complex weather system traps smog and pollution, leading to poor air quality and visibility. The phenomenon is especially vigorous during the winter months that follow the rainy season. It's a decades-old problem for megacities like Mexico City, which topped the United Nations list as the world's most polluted city in 1992, linked to rapid urbanization and rising car ownership. In the 1980s, the problem was so severe that the government decided to tackle the issue. They established a task force, and it quickly became clear that fixing the root cause of the problem would take a long time. Instead, the city authorities were looking for an approach that could deliver immediate results, a quick win. We actually later in the book talk about the fact that there are no quick wins in this world. They also recognized.
We need a page turn up.
Yeah. They also recognized people would only change the behavior if compelled by the law. Sounds familiar? In 1989, driven by these insights, the government launched the Hoi no Circula program, which translates roughly to no driving today. The program proposed an instant 20% reduction in vehicle traffic through a simple mechanism. The last digit on your number plate would determine the day on which you were not allowed to drive your car. If your plate ended on 5 or 6, you weren't allowed to drive on Monday. Vehicles with plates ending on 7 or 8 weren't allowed on Tuesday, and so on. The program was initially in effect Monday to Friday during the winter months, when the air quality was at its worst, but was later changed to run throughout the year and also include Saturdays. At first, the mechanism appeared to work as intended. Traffic reduced and carbon monoxide levels dropped by 11%. But after a short while, emissions started to rise, overshooting the original levels. To get around the driving restriction, people were buying a second car with, of course, different number plates. Many were older cars, second-hand cars, making the situation worse by injecting a large volume of less efficient vehicles into the city's arteries. So again, this is a chapter about the hidden impacts of design decisions, and we later pick up in one of the tactics on this, where we're talking about understanding the unintended consequences. And this is, so here you can see the system, how it works, very simple. This is actually known as the Cobra effect, which some people in this room, I'm sure, are familiar with. The Cobra effect is called this way because it's based on a story from British colonial times in India, where Delhi had a massive cobra problem, a cobra infestation problem. And so the British governors came together and were like, what are we going to do about these deadly snakes and the cobra infestation? And how can we find a solution, a quick win that doesn't cost us much money and solves the problem for us? And they came up with this really clever scheme of putting out a bounty for dead cobras. And so they thought, we'll just get the locals to catch the cobras for us. We'll give them the bounty. And so in no time, we'll be rid of all of the cobras in the city. What do you think what happened? People started breeding cobras in the backyards. Of course, that was became quite obvious quite quickly to the British governors, because they were like, where are all these cobras coming from? They found out about the cobra breeding schemes going on. So they made another big mistake. They shut down the system overnight. So of course, overnight, all of the cobras became worthless, so people released the cobras back into the wild. So hence why we call this the cobra effect, where it's where we have an attempted solution that actually makes the problem worse rather than fixing it. And so is often the case with unintended consequences.
We have lots of examples in Australia around this sort of thing. I'm sure you have some yourself. One of the ones that sort of really gets under my skin is the job placement and training sort of employment services type industry, where as the job placement service, you receive money from the government if someone is employed in a role for more than 3 months. And somebody else receives money for training them, and somebody else receives a discount or a subsidy for employing them. And what is happening instead is the same group sets up a hospitality business and a training business and a job placement business and simply moves people between them. So they train them for a little bit, they place them in employment for 3 months and 1 day, and then they make them redundant or fire them or cancel their contract or whatever it is after collecting money from the government, and they go back into the unemployment queue to be trained again for a new job in the same industry and a new subsidy from the government. Now, from the provider's point of view, that's a lucrative business model, and it's why we've got people in those industries taking photos on yachts in the Mediterranean and driving Lamborghinis. No, that's no exaggeration. And you've got these groups of people who are being perennially just moved between these providers, not really being trained well, not being given the stability that the system is intended for, and not really getting them out of long-term unemployment either. We have a plethora of those sorts of examples where the design of the system is essentially setting up these perverse rewards instead.
We had some slides to also talk about futures and futuring, but I think given the time, maybe we'll just open it up for questions now. What do you think, Steve? Okay. And there were more questions in the room, so I'll just take us to the last slide, skipping the futuring, and we'll open up for any questions. Not there are any questions anymore, of course.
Yeah, I'll take it over.
2-minute plotted history of your best recommendation for taking a group into that future game.
2-minute recommendation for taking a group into. I'm so glad you asked because I prepared some slides for this. All right. So, since you're asking, one of my favorite methods is backcasting. It's a futuring method where we start with the future and then work backwards. And you can see the example here, which looks at energy systems. And so essentially, you do need to sort of precede it a little bit, ideally with an activity that helps participants to think about the future or draw on some existing resources, where we say, okay, in the future, ideally, we have locally produced energy, we have a decentralized grid and neighborhood sharing models. And then you go back in this canvas. And by the way, all these templates are available for free on the Creative Commons license, as well as all the images from the book and illustrations from the book on our website. So then you go back to the current state and go like, okay, how can we, looking at the attributes of the future, mapping them to the now. So at the moment, we have centralized energy and it's controlled by large corporations. And so you go, okay, what are the transition steps now that we need to take in order to shift us a little bit closer to this future? And it's also a little bit like this idea of the 1% change that Steve talked about earlier, that we don't have to do this big leap at once, but we can think about the transition steps and they become much more manageable. And then an extension that we've sort of talked about in the book is that we added to the backcasting method is that we can then also look at projects. So it's kind of these are the transition steps and then doing very specific projects. And that's something actually that I've used myself as a design workshop facilitator working at my previous university, where we were engaging a potential donor, looking at, okay, what projects can we identify that potential donor would be interested and excited about, and really identifying something that's very tangible. So I'll read it out if you can't read it. It says partnering with energy startups or developing new localized grid solutions, running trials with local communities. So now these are very concrete things we can do. And you can use the template and involve participants together in doing this. And you could, well, that's a different story, the 3 horizons. You could also do a pre-seeding step where you get people to, you give people these kinds of cards. We call them persona and concept cards as a starting point. So you go like, okay, these are important actors. We try to avoid the term stakeholders because of the colonial associations with the term. So these are the potential actors that might be involved in this initiative in some way or have a perspective or are impacted, and extending that also to non-human personas. So this is an actual card that was produced by one of the participants in that workshop, and it was actually an indigenous academic who said, okay, what about the ibises? So this was a different project, not about energy, it was about urban developments. And then concept cards, which are about like based on research, kind of taking research ideas and putting them on a card and then giving those to participants. So we usually prepare those cards beforehand. They don't have to look as nicely designed as here, and then give them to participants. Usually give everyone like one persona card, one concept card, and then take them through this casting exercise. If you work in a corporate world, you can also, that's what one of my colleagues at the Transdisciplinary School does, one of our futurists, Susanne Brett. She then overlays also the backcasting with the 3 horizons, which is a bit more well-known in management, and so people might be better able to connect with that, but it also makes it more accessible in a way. So these two work really nicely together. Question over here.
Thank you. I particularly love this, the future scenarios, and that nicely relates to one of the content that we have in our HCI class, where we are trying to encourage students to think in those Black Mirror episodes kind of way, where you think of future scenarios that go, what can go really, really bad and what can go really wrong, and what can we do today in order to prevent that from happening. And I love how this connects to your book with these future scenarios. Do you maybe have some examples of how this is being facilitated in your workshops, or some kind of things?
I have an example from a piece of work we did with the New South Wales Department of Transport going back just a few years. They were looking at implementing some change with the way Opal cards are used, like the tap-on, tap-off payment system. And one of the things that we actually thought through and used as a workshop tactic there was how might this new system, if we design it in the way that we're thinking about, how might this sort of thing be abused by somebody? So how might it be used for coercive control? How might it be used for stalking? How might it be used for, like different sort of scenarios? And then walked backwards to say, well, how do we avoid that? And then how do we use that in the design today of the current system to avoid those sorts of things? We actually involved people who were at risk of those behaviours. So we got teenagers who'd moved out of home and were sort of on that cusp of adulthood, but like we're at risk of parental control, but we're moving away from it. People who had moved out of environments of domestic violence, or but we involved them in the design of those things, so that it wasn't me trying to imagine how might this be poorly used, but people who had been on the receiving end of bad behaviours and abusive behaviours being involved in those things. And then, as I say, working backwards to say, well, what are these things that we would put in place such that the design of this system will explicitly address those concerns?
We're out of time, right? And we still have some books to give away. Is it a copy of our book?
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to announce?
No, you go for it. Go for it.
How it work? Yeah. So there's some flyers on your chairs. Now, some of the flyers have a little star on the back, and if you have a flyer with a star, you're the lucky winner of a free copy of our book. So please come up and see us here after the talk, and we'll get you your copy. Thank you very much for
thank you all so much
for all the great conversations and questions.
Yeah, thank you all so much.